record. There we go, being recorded. Right, we are on page 9b. We're going to actually go on to page 10a today. It's a little bit unsavory, this Gemarah, to say the least, which we're going to be learning today. But the Gemarah doesn't get squeamish about these things, and I guess we mustn't either. Let's crack on. It's on page 48 if you are in the hardback paper Gemarah, 9b, towards the bottom. Last week we spoke about the idea of kam le midraba minei, that a person will only get the greater of the two punishments if he is due for two punishments. That's what we spoke about last week. And then we got to this little symbol over it. Oh, I need to share the screen, don't I? Hang on a sec. There we go. Then we got to this little symbol here, which tells us that we are getting to a new situation, a new subject. And now this, we started this last week, and it is the subject of whether a person can split the testimony into two, and you'll see what that means in a minute. Let's go from the top here. We did a bit of this last week, but let's recap. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Hevi habal edim she zinata. The husband brought witnesses that his wife had committed adultery. Vehevi ha'av edim vehezimum le'edei habal. And the father brought witnesses to discredit that first set of witnesses, and to say you couldn't have seen this, witnessed this act of alleged adultery at the time and place you say, because you weren't there. I know that because you were with me, or you were with us, more accurately. Eidei habal neheragim. The first lot of witnesses who tried to get the woman killed as an adulteress will suffer the same punishment that they tried to get on her comes back on them, and they are executed. Ve'ein mishalmin mamon, but they do not pay money. What's the money? That is the lower value of the ketubah, which would have ensued because of the fact that she was not a virgin, and therefore she wouldn't get the full ketubah. But because of the concept of kam le midraba minei, because of the concept that we only give a person the greater of the two punishments, they will get executed, but they don't have to pay the fine. That was what we did last week.
Johnny, excuse me, if the husband knew that he was bringing false witnesses, would he be chayav mita as well?
Yeah, whoever it is. Yeah.
Yeah.
We're going to see that in the next case.
Okay.
So I see what you mean. So I see what you're asking. You're asking me the no is the answer, because we learned this a few weeks ago, if you remember. Yeah. You can't be a shaliach for an aveira. So the witnesses, who are the ones that swear falsely and say, I was there when I saw you commit adultery, they're the ones that are punished. Okay, the husband put them up to it, and they have paid them very well for doing so, but they have to take responsibility for their actions, because ein shaliach lidvar aveira. You can't appoint a shaliach to do an aveira for you. So the husband in this situation does not get punished, only the witnesses themselves. Okay? Now, next case. It's building on the first case. Chazar. והביא הבעל עדים והזימום לעדי האב. So now the case is this. The husband brings witnesses to say that his wife committed adultery. The father of this woman brings witnesses to say, you are false witnesses because you weren't where you said you were with us. The husband now brings another set of witnesses that rubbishes them and says, well, you've just told me that the first set of witnesses were with you in the Trafford Centre on Monday afternoon, and therefore they could not have been watching this adultery. Well, I know that that's not true because you weren't in the Trafford Centre at all. You were, you were at Halpin's. I saw you there. You were there with me. So you're also in the category of Eidim Zomamim. So what happens there? Well, we carry on with the whole scenario. Eidei ha'av neheragin. In that scenario, the witnesses of the father who have now been trashed, they are put to death by execution. Umishalmin mamon, but they do pay out money. Why? What about the concept of kamle midarabamine, that we only give them the higher of the two punishment, the worse of the two punishments? Well, that doesn't count when we're dealing with a crime, as it were, against two separate people. And let's just let Marcel in. There we go. Here, they get executed because they were trying to get the first lot of witnesses executed. But they have to pay money because the cost of the ketubah is against somebody else, not against those witnesses. It's against the wife or the husband, depending on which way it goes. So it's two separate crimes, if you like. These witnesses who have been discredited, the second lot, are executed because they tried to get the first lot of witnesses executed. And they also tried to cause monetary loss to somebody else. So in that scenario, they get both punishments. We don't say kam le midrabamine because it's not two punishments for one person. It's one punishment against one person and one punishment because of a crime against another person. And that's where we ended last week. So that was Rav Yosef's opinion up here, right in the top where the little symbol is, Amar Rav Yosef. So while we're at it, we're going to talk about another statement of Rav Yosef, which is to do with witnesses. And again, it starts to get a little bit unsavory here. Amar Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says, Ploni Ravao Lo'onso. Person says that so-and-so sodomized him against his will. Okay, he says, so-and-so raped me by anal intercourse, which is forbidden. It's forbidden. Hu va'acher mitztarfin lahargo. He himself, i.e. the victim, and another witness can join together to convict the perpetrator. So in other words, it doesn't need two independent witnesses in this case. The victim himself can act as one of the two witnesses. We know we need two witnesses for all these kind of cases, but it doesn't need to be two independent witnesses. The victim himself can act as a witness and can join, mitztarfin, can join. Those of you who have joined in our tiyulim may have seen that in the Hebrew notice that we send out. Anybody who wants to join should contact me by email. Same word, mitztarfin, can join in. So who? That means he, i.e. the victim. V'acher, and somebody else, i.e. one independent witness, mitztarfin, can join together the horgo in order to convict and therefore bring about the execution of the perpetrator. Fine. Straightforward that. He can be a witness. Now, what about if he says, liritzono? So this case here was so-and-so raped me against my will. He sodomized me against my will. This one says, I consented to this action. So it wasn't rape, it was consensual anal intercourse, which is forbidden. Lo mishkav zachar. You shall not have a homosexual act. So now you've got a problem. So somebody says, I consented to this act. So what's he doing? Rasha, who? He's actually saying, I am a Rasha. He is incriminating himself. We spoke a little bit about this last week with the Fifth Amendment. Torah Amra, and the Torah says, Al Tashet Rasha aid. Do not join in with a wicked person to be a witness. So therefore, if he's a wicked person, the other person, the other witness, the one independent witness, cannot join with him because he has incriminated himself and he has made himself clearly a Rasha. You'll remember I told you the story about the wedding that I went to where one of the witnesses was a recognized thief. He was not allowed to be a witness. Here, somebody who says, I consented to this act, which is forbidden according to the Torah, he is automatically in the category of a Rasha, of an evil person, and he is not allowed to be a witness. There's a separate pasuk which is being quoted here in Shemot from Parashat Mishpatim, which says, "Do not join in to be to join in with an evil person to be a witness." So he can't be a witness, and the independent witness, the second witness, as it were, cannot join with him to make a pair of witnesses. So we can't convict the perpetrator on the basis of the evidence of a consenting person to this act. That's Rav Yosef's opinion. Rava says something slightly different. He says, Adam karov etzel atzmo. We know, don't we, because we learned it a few weeks ago, that one of the categories of people who can't be a witness is a relative. Never mind whether he's a Rasha, he's an evil person or not. We don't even need to come on to that, says Rava. Rava says this person cannot be a witness because he's a relative. Who's he a relative of? Himself. According to Rava's opinion, a person is considered related to himself. Makes sense, really, because if you can't be a witness for a close relative, you can't get any closer relative, I guess, than yourself. So I think it's fairly logical, what Rava is saying. Adam karov etzel atzmo. Ve'ein Adam misim atzmo rasha. And therefore, a person cannot incriminate himself. Clever this, because what Rava is saying is this. You've just told me this person is a Rasha, and therefore his testimony doesn't count. But how do you know he's a Russia? He's a Russia because he's told me he's consented. But he can't give testimony about himself because he's a relative of himself. So his testimony that he consented doesn't count. So therefore, he's not a Russia because there's no witness to say he's a Russia because he can't be a witness on himself. So a person cannot incriminate himself, not because of the Fifth Amendment, but because he's a relative of himself. It's very sophisticated, the logic here. And it's amazing, this really, if you think about it, because it really is quite convoluted, but it makes perfect logical sense. Rava is saying, okay, you're saying this person is a Russia, and therefore we can't add his testimony to somebody else's testimony. But I'm telling you, he's not a Russia, because the only way he can be made a Russia is if he testifies against himself. And he can't because he's a relative of himself. So therefore, he's not a Russia. So right at the moment, if he's not a Russia, then he can join in with the other person and and convict the perpetrator. Has everybody got the logic on that? Yeah, okay, good. Right, what's the problem with it? Before we turn over the page, what's the problem with that logic?
But he's going to be, whatever evidence he gives, he's going to be executed as well because he's committed the sin, which is a capital offence. Yes.
Okay. The problem with that logic is that it doesn't hold for the whole case. We've just said that his testimony about himself is rejected because he's a relative of himself. Okay, so if his testimony is rejected because he's a relative of himself, well, then the testimony is rejected altogether. So how can he then have that same testimony accepted for the perpetrator? Either the testimony is accepted, and if it's accepted, he's a Russia and the other guy can't join in, or it's rejected and he's not a Russia, but it's rejected altogether because he's a relative. You can't have it both ways. What Rava wants is his cake and eat it. He wants to say, I'm accepting the bit of the testimony that says so-and-so sodomized the person, but I'm not accepting the same testimony that says so-and-so sodomized the person with my consent. Because once you say with my consent, then you're making yourself into a Russia. Well, you can't make yourself into a Russia because you're a relative of yourself. So your testimony is rejected. So if your testimony is rejected about yourself, it's got to be rejected about the other person as well, because it's the same testimony. How can you have the testimony accepted on one side and not accepted on the other side? It's not consistent. So how do we get around that? Rava's got a bit of a problem here. So any suggestions?
Is there a difference between a monetary case and a capital case? I think there is, from what I read in Rabbi Stein's house. If a person wants to say, I did pinch money and he wants to atone for himself, then although it's a Russia, he can atone for himself.
That's true. That's true. He can admit that is true.
Yeah. That's a monetary case, though, isn't it, John?
Yeah, it's only the idea of a person not being able to incriminate himself. Remember, to to be disqualified as a witness, it's not everybody who does an Aveira. Else none of us would ever be able to be witnesses, because Ein Adam Ba'aretz Asher Ya'aseh Tov V'lo Yechata. There's nobody on earth that doesn't do any sin. It's only certain types of things. We know that, don't we? Get dice players. See if we can remember the 4 things. Dice players, pigeon flyers, Shemitah traders, and what was the 4th one? I've forgotten.
People who eat food on the street. Eat food on the street.
Eating
that
on the
was
street.
an extra one. People who eat food on the streets. That was another one. What was the 4th one?
It was also to do with betting.
No, interest.
Players, pigeon fanciers, pigeon flyers, Shemitah produce. What was the 4th one? Come on.
Lending money on interest.
Lending money with interest. Thank you, Leon. Thank you, Leon. Lending money with interest. I've forgotten that one. So yes, Johnny, you're right. Those kind of, it's only those kind of people, and it only applies, as Rav Steinsaltz says here down here, applies in cases involving fines, lashes, and execution. Ordinary monetary cases, personal admission to a debt is as reliable as the testimony of 100 impartial witnesses, because you can choose to give the money back. So here Rava has a problem. We've challenged Rava to say, well, let's go on and see. Turn over the page. Amar Rava. This is the next one. Let's stop there for a moment. So our problem is that we've got an inconsistency. Either you're going to disqualify the entire testimony on the basis that he can't make himself into a Rosha, or you're going to accept the entire testimony, in which case he's a Rosha and the guy can't join in with it. So how do we get around that? Well, it's quite simple, actually. We make up a new rule. Okay, and the rule is Umi Palginin Dibura. We do split the testimony. We do exactly that, and we'll see that as we go on in the next piece of Gemarah, that we actually do split his testimony into 2 parts. And we'll see as we go on. But before we do that, we have to do another couple of cases, which teaches another principle. So on to page 10a. Amar Rava. Rava says, Ploni Ba'al Ishti. Such a body, so-and-so, committed adultery with my wife. Right? So what's the halakha? If you have an adulterer and an adulteress, assuming that the adulteress is not under duress out in the field, what is the halakha? What happens to these 2 people?
Executed.
Executed, correct. They are chayav mita, both of them. So you can see where we're going with this. Somebody comes along and says, Fred Bloggs committed adultery with my wife. Hu va'acher, he and one other witness. There was one other witness to this act. So he, the husband, and the one other witness, mitzdarfin, join together, lehargo, to cause the execution of him, lehargo, of him, i.e. the adulterer. Aval lo leharga, but not to cause the execution of the adulteress. Why not?
Because they're related.
Because they're related, correct. A person cannot testify about a relative, and a wife is considered a relative.
Not a blood relation.
Doesn't matter. It's in the list. And not only that, we learned this a couple of weeks ago. A person's wife or husband is considered the same as another person. So your brother-in-law is also considered to be your brother because he's the brother of your wife. Okay, we learned that. That was in the list that we learned when I think Marcel asked the question a few weeks ago, who were the relatives, and we went through that. So this case of Rava is that in this case, the male adulterer will get put to death, but the wife will not. Asks the Gemarah, my kamashmalan, very famous and common Gemarah expression. My kamashmalan. What do we learn from this? In other words, why is the Gemarah bringing me this case? What additional thing can I learn from this case that I couldn't learn from the previous case? Asks the Gemarah, Dime palginan badibura. Is it that we learn the concept that we split the testimony? In other words, we accept part of it and we reject the other part. Says the Gemarah, that can't be what we're learning from this piece of Gemarah. Hainu hach, because this case, hainu, this case, hach, is the same as that one. There's no difference. Okay, because if you're going to say the wife is not put to death because she is a relative of the husband who's giving testimony, that's the same idea as this fellow who's a relative of himself who's not allowed to give testimony about himself. So that's not what we're learning. This cannot be, as a principle in this case, is identical to that case in which the witness is not accepted to incriminate himself. So the Gemarah says, no, I'll tell you why we need this second case of the husband and wife case. Adam karov etzel atzmo amrinon, etzel ishto lo amrinon. You might have said, well, the two cases are different because, as I said before, you can't get any closer relative than yourself. Maybe that only applies, this idea only applies to yourself. In other words, you can't incriminate because you can't give testimony against yourself. And maybe you can give testimony against your wife. And this case comes along and says, no, you can't. It tells you it's the same principle, because you might think there was a difference between a person giving testimony against himself and a person giving testimony against his wife. Ka mashmalon. That is what it teaches us. That's the same expression here. Here it was my ka mashmalon, question mark. What is this coming to teach us? It's coming to teach us that a wife is considered the same as oneself with regard to testimony. Kamash malon. That's another use of this expression, which you'll see over and over again in the Gemarah. That usually ends that particular case. Kamash malon. That is what the Gemarah is coming to teach us.
If the fellow's wife, if the fellow's sister's husband, that's his brother-in-law through his sister, had an affair with his wife, so it's her brother-in-law, they both get off.
Presumably, yes, because he would be, or you don't even need to be so convoluted. You could just say his brother. What about if it was his brother?
Oh, brother, yeah.
And if there was brother-in-law, but yeah, you're right.
So brother-in-law, yeah.
It would be the same principle, exactly. Yeah. Correct. So you've applied the principle a little bit wider there, and that's correct. So whilst we're on this subject, the Gemarah is going to carry on with this whole idea of witnesses to adultery and these kind of unpleasant things. And also it's another statement of Rava. So Rava then comes along and says, here's another statement I'm going to make. Ploni ba al na'ara hama orasa. So-and-so, and he names him, Fred Bloggs, comes along and he engaged in intercourse with this betrothed na'ara. Okay, a girl. Na'ara is a girl. And we will come back to what exactly a na'ara is shortly. The moment we'll just refer to her as a betrothed girl. Steinzelt says a young woman, but okay, I'll accept that. Okay, and he doesn't say who the young girl was. He just says, I witnessed so-and-so having intercourse with a betrothed woman, betrothed girl. V'huzmu, and these witnesses who said that were found out to be false. Somebody came along and said, no, you did not witness that act on Monday afternoon at 3 o'clock because you were with us watching the footy, okay? And you could not have been there where you say you were. What happens to those witnesses who tried to cause trouble and made false accusations? Neheragin, they are executed. Ve'ein mishalmin mamon, but they do not pay the money. Why not? Why not? Why don't they pay the money? Why are they executed but they don't have to pay the money?
Because they didn't say who the woman was, so therefore the father of the woman wouldn't be penalized.
Well, they never specified the woman, so therefore, say that again, Michael. I think you said it right. Say it again.
As the woman wasn't named, therefore the father of the bride to be wouldn't have suffered any damage.
Correct. There was no monetary loss because on the basis of their evidence, nobody can say that the daughter lost was now damaged goods, as it were, and is due to be compensated. Or the father is due to be compensated, as Michael correctly said. And how do we know it's the father and not the woman herself? How do we know it's the father? Because of this word here, na'ara, because she is a young girl. She's a young girl who has not yet reached the age where she is responsible for herself. And therefore, it is her father. She's a na'ara. She's still under the, if you like, the auspices of her father. And therefore, the money which would go which would be paid because of the loss of reputation, etc., goes to the father. And na'ara is a person who is not yet 12 and a half years old. After that, she's no longer called a na'ara.
Doesn't betrothed mean engaged, Johnny?
It means betrothed. There's a difference. Yeah. Remember, there are two parts to the wedding ceremony, to the wedding process. There is erusin, which is what we would call engagement. Yeah. And then there is nisuin, there is the marriage. In the olden days, there was 12 months between them. You would do an erusin, and then the bride would then go back to her father's house for 12 months while they did everything they were meant to do, get all the stuff together and make the preparations, etc. And then they would have the chuppah, which would be the nisuin, the marriage. And then they would live together as man and wife. Today, because of the problems of the breaking up of an erusin, of breaking of an engagement, we only do a vort. Okay, we do a vort, which is that the two sets of parents give their word. The word vort means a word. They give their word that they will do everything in their power to make sure the wedding goes ahead. But it is not an erusin, except in some very, very limited Hasidic circumstances where they still do erusin. Very, very few these days, but there are certain real hardcore Hasidic sects that still practice erusin. We do erusin now immediately before the chuppah, so that there is no chance that it can break up between the erusin and the nisuin, because if it breaks up between the erusin, between the betrothal and the nisuin, then you need a type of get, and it is the woman will be sort of divorced, even though she's never actually got married. So to avoid that potential these days, we no longer do an erusin 12 months before the nisuin. Here we're talking about during that 12-month period. She's already betrothed. She's half married, if you like. She's certainly forbidden to any other man. And if any other man comes along and has marital relations with her, he is an adulterer, even though she's not yet fully married. And that's the scenario we're talking here. Hana'ara ham'orasa. As you quite rightly say, John, it's an engaged woman. But we'll use the word betrothed because it gives us the flavour of what's gone on with an erusin as opposed to an engagement today.
So she could be less than 12 and a half still?
She's going to be less than 12 and a half at this point, yeah.
And engaged. Okay.
And engaged, yeah. She
okay.
won't get married. She won't get married until after that. But she could well be under 12 and a half when she gets engaged.
Okay, thank you.
So our case here is that somebody comes along and says, I saw Fred Bloggs have relations with an engaged, a betrothed woman, and they don't mention who that betrothed woman was. As Michael has quite rightly said, he doesn't have to pay any money because there's no money lost, because he hasn't specified who it was. But he is put to death because his intention, or what the result of his testimony, had it been accepted, would have been that Plony, Fred Bloggs, would have got the chop. Actually, he wouldn't have got the chop, he'd have got the stone. He'd have been stoned. So he would have get the same punishment. What if he said, however, Plony ba al bito shel Plony? Fred Bloggs had marital relations with the daughter of Chaim Yankel. Well, in that case, he has specified who it is, and therefore the daughter of Chaim Yankel is now entitled to compensation, because what these witnesses, who were then later on discredited, were trying to do was to get Fred Bloggs killed, and she would lose money, because if their testimony had been accepted, she would then be damaged goods and therefore would be, inverted commas, worth less. So they would then have to pay the money. So you're going to say to me, hang on a minute, what about kam lei midarabba minei? What about the concept that I stressed to you last week, that in that scenario, a person only gets the worse of the two punishments? And your response will be, it's the same as the case we had earlier on. It's two different people. The one lot is against Fred Bloggs, and the other lot, the monetary case, is against the daughter of Chaim Yankel. So two different people involved, and therefore we don't apply the concept of kam lei midarabba minei, because it's not two punishments as it were, for one crime. It's two punishments for two crimes. And two crimes are trying to get Fred Bloggs killed and trying to get the daughter of Chaim Yankel to lose money. So they have to pay both. That's very nice. So we understand that, okay? Very clear. Logic clear, case clear. Now, we're getting into even more unpleasant categories now. We've now Rava, who's on a roll at this point, goes on to say another case. Amar Rava. Rava says, Ploni Rava Hashor. So-and-so engaged in intercourse with an ox. Not something that you would really want to be witnessing, but that's what they say. These witnesses say they saw. That is a capital offense. We read it. It's in the same laning that we say on Yom Kippur afternoon, as is the one above about anal intercourse, Mishkav Zachar. This is in the same parsha in Vayikra, and we read it on the afternoon of Yom Kippur. So these witnesses say, so-and-so engaged in bestiality with an ox, which would then cause, if their testimony is accepted, the punishment would be what?
Death.
Death for who?
Both.
Yes, both the human perpetrator and the ox. Seems a bit unfair on the ox to me, but still, I don't suppose the ox had much choice in the matter. But however, that is the halacha. Now, what if they then get these witnesses are discredited? The same scenario, neheragin. These witnesses are executed because they were trying to get Fred Bloggs executed because they said Fred Bloggs had committed a capital offense with this ox. But ein mishalmin mamon. But they don't have to pay the value of the ox to the ox's owner. Why not?
Because they didn't say which ox it was.
Correct.
Just
Correct, Johnny. They just said Fred Bloggs had intercourse with an ox, and he didn't specify which ox. So if he doesn't specify which ox, we don't know which ox to put to death, and therefore no ox's owner has suffered a monetary loss. So ein mishalmin mamon, there's no money to pay. However, if they say shoro shel ploni, these witnesses says Fred Bloggs had intercourse with Chaim Yankel's ox. Well, Fred Bloggs is going to get put to death as a result of that testimony, as is Chaim Yankel's ox. Poor Chaim Yankel has lost his ox, lost the value of his ox. So in that case, when these witnesses are discredited by another pair of witnesses who said, you did not witness such an act at such a time because you couldn't have done because you weren't there, you were with us. They are then executed because they tried to get Fred Bloggs executed. O meshalmin mamon, and they have to pay Chaim Yankel the value of the ox. Why? Same reason. Mamon lazeh unafashot lazeh. It's not one person doing two crimes. It's one person doing a crime against Chaim Yankel and a second crime against Fred Bloggs, or the other way around, really. Fred Bloggs first because he's going to get put to death, and then Chaim Yankel because he's lost the value of his ox. Yes, Jeffrey?
The poor ox, he didn't really have, he's not done anything wrong. Why should he lose his life?
I know, I said that a few minutes ago. It seems a bit harsh on the ox, really, doesn't it? I think that the reason is if I'm not mistaken, is that there is a concept of what's the expression, David? You shall remove this hara mikir becha. You shall remove this evil from your midst. What's the exact expression? V'heisir et hara mikir becha, and you shall remove the evil from your midst. It's just very distasteful that an ox should be around that this has happened to. People know that it's happened to this ox, and people will then be reminded of that disgusting act. And you know what people are like. People will come and have a look. Oh, look, there's the ox that so and so had intercourse with, and it will all be talked about. And the idea is that we should try and remove the evil from our midst, and so the ox has to go, I'm afraid. You're right, Jeffrey. I also thought it was a bit harsh on the ox, but that I think is the source for that halakha. Leon.
Well, this argument falls down if somebody has more than one ox. So there's not going to be any, and they can't identify which ox it was. I assume that the sages are assuming that nobody has more than one ox.
Either that, or they were able to identify which of the oxen it was, because presumably they're all marked. They all have, they're branded, or they have a little thingy on their ear, don't they? That little yellow thing on their ear with a number on it. So
well, they do, but they all have the same for each owner. Each owner has his own brand or his yellow tag.
Maybe the yellow tag had a number on it,
yes.
Number one ox, number two ox. You're right. You're 100% right, Leon. The principle is they have to be able to identify the ox definitively. You can't just say, okay, well, I'll just take any old ox of Chaim Yankel because, he might have 100 and we don't know which one it was. You're right. It has to be an identifiable ox. So it could be that he's only got one, or that it was able to be identified for these purposes. So quite right. That's a very correct point. Julia, you're desperate to ask me a question.
I'm not. I'm desperate to make an observation, really. My observation is that everybody's very clearly English, that the unfairness should centre on the ox. And in fact, I think that there's probably another reason, that it's like a taste of blood, isn't it? Once you've had it, that the ox could be a danger. But surely it was very unfair that the adulteress couldn't be convicted because she couldn't be convicted on her husband's testimony. And it was even more unfair that in the homosexual case, that one of the men could be convicted, but the other one, because of split testimony, but the other one seemed to be able to get off. I would have thought that was unfair.
Okay.
My other final thought was, I saw a very good television program this week called Clarkson's Farm, which actually I hate to admit I enjoyed, but it was really interesting about sheep, and I would recommend it.
Okay, there's no bestiality in it, is there?
No.
Okay, that's good. Okay, thank you for that. Let's take the two cases that you raised and see if we can deal with it. The first one is the adulteress. She gets off on a technicality because there aren't two witnesses, kosher witnesses, to say that she committed adultery. And as a lawyer, you will of course be familiar with clients being able to be found not guilty on a technicality, and that's exactly what happens here. It's a technicality. Everybody knows that it happened because the man is convicted. and the case is very clear that, but there are not two kosher witnesses, and we have to uphold the strict application of that, because if we don't, we'll be opening up a huge can of worms about witnesses. The halacha is al pi shnaim edim, on the or shlosha edim, on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is put to death, and not on the testimony of 1. And there is only, in this case, only 1 kosher witness for her activity, because a person cannot, a husband cannot testify against his wife. So you're right, it doesn't seem naturally just, but it's a technicality. And the same is with the homosexual case, exactly the same concept. It's a technicality.
That really wasn't my observation. My observation was that it was interesting that the commentary and your discussion raised in detail the unfairness to an animal when there was unfairness to people, but that didn't seem to raise any comment.
I think it's the opposite way around. The unfairness to the animal is that the ox gets put to death for an act which presumably the ox did not consent to. The unfairness is in the other way around. The woman and the homosexual case don't get put to death, they get off. So it's not that it's unfair, it's overfair, if you like. I think there's a big difference. To say it's unfair that she doesn't get put to death, or the homosexual guy doesn't get put to death, we're trying to get people off here, and I think we're feeling sorry for the ox, because the ox really has not expressed his wishes one way or the other.
What happens if a sheep comes along and says the ox wasn't there? The sheep was.
I've been dying to say this for a long time, but you identify the ox by seeing which one has a smile on its face.
I think all of you have been reading Animal Farm. Okay, so the principle is expressed in the cases that we've done. What have we learned in terms of principle? We've learned that a person can't incriminate himself because he's a relative of himself. A person can't give testimony against his wife. And Kamle Midarabba Mine does not apply when it's 2 different people involved, 2 different victims. But if the victim is not named, then there is no monetary loss, and therefore there is no monetary fine to pay. That's where we've got to. Now, same question that we had before. Ha tu lama li. Why do I need that second case of the ox? It's the same principle as the betrothed woman case, i.e. non-identification of the woman in the betrothed woman case and the ox in the ox case. What extra does the ox case teach us over and above that which we can learn from the betrothed woman case? It's not just there just to stress the point. We must be a reason why Rava brings that case as well as the other one. Hainu hach. This is the same as that. In other words, the cases are the same. Answers the Gemarah. No, we needed the second case. Why? Mishum deka ba'i baya ilave. Because there might be a question. The ba'i Rava. Rava questioned Ploni Rava Shori. What about somebody who says so-and-so, Fred Bloggs, committed bestiality, had a sexual relation with my ox? What's the halacha? what do we say? Mahu. What's halacha? Mi amrinon. Do we say Adam karov etzel atzmo? A person is his own relative concerning this testimony. Ve'ein Adam karov etzel mamono. But maybe we say a person is not his own relative when it comes to his property, and therefore his testimony would be accepted, and therefore the ox would be destroyed. Or Dilma, perhaps, Amrinon, we say, Adam karov etzel mamono. No, a person is considered to be his own relative when it comes to his property as well. And therefore, his testimony against his own ox is invalid, and therefore the ox gets off on a technicality. And if we did not say that there was split testimony, then Fred Bloggs would get off as well, because the whole testimony goes up in smoke. But we do say that there is split testimony. We've already learned that. So that's the question. Is a person considered to be his own relative only when it comes to himself, in other words, incriminating himself, or is he considered to be his own relative when it comes to his own monetary loss, i.e. this ox case? So that's the question. So what's the answer? What do we think the answer is? Without looking on. Who thinks there's a distinction between the ox and the person? Hands up. Julia. Stephen, I think, has got a finger poking up, so I'll accept that, yeah. David thinks so. Howard thinks so. All right, who thinks that a person is considered a relative regarding his money and therefore can't incriminate himself to lose money? No one. So we've got a few abstentions. Okay. Well, those of you that raised your hands are correct. A person is not considered to be his own relative as far as his money is concerned. Batar, he went ahead, the Baya Hadar Pashata. After he raised the question, Batar means after. The Ba'aya, you know what a Ba'aya is? You'll have heard that many times. Ma Ba'aya, what's the problem? So after he raised the problem, we're talking about Rava now, Hadar, he returned Pshata, and he gave Pashat. He gave the explanation. So in other words, he answered his own question, and he said, Adam karov etzel atzmo, a person is considered to be a relative regarding himself. Ve'ein Adam karov etzel mamono, but he is not considered to be his own relative when it comes to his money. And therefore, in the case of my ox, which I say was raped by a person, then my testimony stands. And if I say that, then and it's proved to be the case, then Fred Bloggs will get executed and my ox will be destroyed, because I am not disqualified from giving evidence about my own property. And that is what you were saying earlier on, Johnny, from the Steinsaltz note a bit further up the page. What Rav Steinsaltz was saying further up here in the page was basically a summary when we got to over here. So now we've come to another little symbol here, which means that we have finished that little section. So today we managed to do a whole section of Gemarah. So we're making real progress now because we now know a lot of these terms. We don't have to keep going over them. And we are understanding the way the Gemarah is thinking in a much more clear way than we did right at the beginning. So we may not have to wait 100 years to finish the whole thing. We may actually get there sooner. Yes, David Marks.
Oh, I didn't have my hand up, but whilst you asked me, we will get, talking about the pace of the shiur, we will get, when we get to chapter 7, we'll actually find a Mishnah that discusses why, in the case of bestiality, the animal is liable for the death penalty as well as the person. Well,
since it's going to be a very long time till we get to chapter 7, do you want to give us a summary of the reason?
I'll just tell you what the coordinates got in front, and there'll be a whole discussion on it when we get there. One is because the person's downfall, the person's death, was as a result of this animal. And just as in the case where someone is involved in idol worship with a tree, and the tree is cut down as a warning for people against idol worship. Similarly here, the animal would be stoned. And that's what you were saying before. Second reason the Mishnah gives is that the animal shouldn't be allowed to carry on walking through the streets, and for people to say, that so-and-so ox was responsible for the death of Chaim Yankel.
Yeah, so it's basically the what we said earlier on, which is gone through in the Mishnah, which eventually we'll get to. Thank you for that. Okay, we're going to stop there because we're going to start a completely new subject. But we're going to go right back to the Mishnah next week, and we're going to we were talking about the case of the defamer from the Mishnah. Now we're going to be, next one is we're going to go back to the Mishnah and says that anybody who's going to get lashes if he's convicted must be judged by 3 judges. That's going to be the source of the next piece of Gemarah, which, please God, we will do next week. Any questions before I stop the recording? Okay, in that case, let me stop the recording.